welcome to the 370th episode of The Business of Story, the show Feedspot.com named the #1 business storytelling podcast for 2022. I'm Park Howell, and I'm darn proud of their recognition and so happy you're with us today, because today you'll learn how to overcome stigma with your storytelling. Let's face it, you think the world of your business, your industry, and the product or service you provide. But people tell themselves a lot of anti-stories about you and your work. And guess what? Your job is to reframe their point of view, provide them with a true optimistic outlook about what you can do for them. One of the industries that has historically had to overcome a lot of stigma is mental health. Yet, given all we've been through with the pandemic, living in the most divided country we've seen in a century, the seclusion we find ourselves in working from home, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous future before us, we have a lot going on between our ears, and much of it is not very healthy for our brain. I love the thought from Joe Dispenza, an international mindfulness coach, who says, "Your personality is your personal reality." And guess what? Your personality and the reality it creates for you is nothing but a story that you get to author. But our negativity bias naturally tunes us to horror stories that gain even more strength if you watch just 20 minutes of news. But what if you reframed those stories you're telling yourself and even help your colleagues, customers, and the communities you serve see you and your offering in a whole new positive light? Today's guests will show you how they've had to reframe the stigma around mental health for their growing startup, evolvedMD, and its brand story. But much of the early success of evolvedMD is really the result of their successful reframing of their own personal stories.
Therapy is not about sitting on a couch with a box of Kleenex telling your deepest, darkest secrets. Therapy for a lot of people is about, framing the way you view your life, both the positives and the negatives, and then working on skills and then deploying those skills in your everyday life. And so for me, I get anxious from time to time. The great thing with managing your anxiety is there are some very basic skills around breathing or meditation or others. For me, when I talk to my friends about my therapy journey, it's largely about reframing the way that I've looked at certain aspects of my life, whether it was my parents, my upbringing, my relationships, and it's about skill building, right? Taking very tangible things that I can deploy when I feel a certain way. And guess what? If you're disciplined about these things and you start to build up those skills, when you need them, they work.
Eric Osland is the managing partner of evolvedMD that started from a personal experience he had with his chronically ill father that illuminated the depths of mental illness and how few services were available. Prior to evolvedMD, Eric founded another healthcare venture, a clinical lab specializing in anatomical pathology services that was ultimately acquired by one of the nation's largest diagnostic laboratories in 2020. With an extensive and proven background in B2B sales, management, and influencing high-level leaders, Eric gained national exposure and experience managing teams as the director of national accounts at several large medical device companies. Joining Eric today is evolvedMD's head of strategy, Sentari Minor. Sentari is at the forefront of healthcare innovation with a scope of work that includes strategy, growth, branding, culture, coaching, and storytelling. Prior to evolvedMD, he worked with some of the nation's most prominent and curious CEOs and entrepreneurs, advising on philanthropy, policy, and everything social good as regional director of Gen Next. And he strengthened social enterprises as director at venture philanthropy firm Social Venture Partners. So if you're ready to reframe the stories you're telling yourself, as well as those stories told about your brand, then settle in with Eric Osland and Sentari Minor of evolvedMD. Eric and Sentari, welcome to the show.
Great to be a part of it. Thanks for having us.
Hey, Park.
Absolutely. Sentari, thanks for setting this up. You and I go back, 10, 15 years now, maybe, for first meeting through your work at Social Venture Partners, and then your career as it has progressed from there. Followed you all along the way, and your great work out of Goodwill of Central and Northern Arizona on their board, and now you're over here at evolvedMD. So thanks for reaching out and getting this set up.
No, I'm super excited. Thanks for having us, Park. It's been fun watching your pivot and everything on Business of Story that you've done, taking the great work that you had as an agency owner and then applying it to business practices for entrepreneurs and leaders. And then I think, as I recall, when George and I launched our podcast, Figure It Out, in 2016, I think you were our first guest. So thanks for taking that plunge with us.
That's right, man. That was a long time ago now, it seems.
Long time ago. Yep.
I just celebrated my 7th anniversary of this show. And honestly, Sentari, I never thought I could hang out for that long doing this over and over again. So it's really great to be here with you guys. And Eric, nice to meet you. You are doing some incredible work over at evolvedMD. And I would certainly, as my listeners would too, like to learn more about your backstory and how this has all evolved into evolvedMD.
Yeah, thanks, Park. Our team is doing some really great work in the mental health space and the behavioral health space. And my story is it's not that interesting, but it's interesting at the same time. I mean, I had a very traditional career. I came up in the med tech industry. After graduating from college, I essentially went straight into it. And I spent the first 15 years of my career working for large entities, either in the healthcare delivery side, the services side, or on the med tech product side. And I think I went through an experience as a professional that a lot of folks do, which is, you get to a stage where you have children and you evaluate the next stage of your life. And for me, that evaluation was largely centered around the impact that I was making, both in my community and abroad. And I didn't feel as though the next 20 years of my career in corporate America would lead to the impact that I was looking for. And at the same time, I was going through a very personal experience with my own family and my father, who was chronically ill. And that experience, ultimately led me to my entrepreneurial journey, which is the initiation of evolvedMD.
What I'm really fascinated by is, what was it about that your chronically ill father that helped really trigger you to dive into, or what was, in addition to that, the need that you saw out there that just simply wasn't being fulfilled in the healthcare industry?
Yeah, I think some of the best products or services come from folks that are trying to address a personal need. And that certainly was the case for me. And so the story of my dad is, for the last 10 years of his life, he was chronically ill. And, I guess that, we were going through the process of end of life planning for my dad. And I was very fortunate to come from the healthcare field and to have resources at my disposal. And at the time, I had a very talented clinical pharmacist that worked with me on a project. And we started to evaluate my dad as this test case. And we were interested in his chronic conditions, but we were also very interested in the medications that he was taking and how that might impact his overall well-being. And so for my dad, he had renal failure, he had hypertension, he had pulmonary issues, and he had onset dementia. And as it relates to those disease sets, as well as a number of other things, he was on 17 medications. And so the conversation internally at our family was, is dad a really sick guy? Or is dad a really sick guy and it's being compounded by the fact that he's on so many medications? And so we really started to dive into that, really just as a personal family journey. And I pulled our clinical pharmacist in, and we used my dad as the guinea pig for a model known as medication therapy management, where you use a clinical pharmacist not to dole out medications, but to really deliver at the top of their licensure to evaluate complex chronically ill patients and focus solely on the medication components. So things like dosing optimization, formulary, polypharmacy is actually a very big issue in healthcare. And polypharmacy, for those of you that don't know, is it means that you're being prescribed 2 medications from different providers for the same thing. There's also issues around compliance and educating, and not just educating the patient, but educating the family as well. And so for my family, these things were all really important, because my mom was frustrated as the caregiver because she was having a difficult time getting my dad to take the medications. They were spending a lot of money. I think they were on Medicare and still spending $900 a month on medications. And so there were all these things that ultimately trickled down to a scenario where, my dad was a sick guy. He wasn't doing well. And then it was having this impact on my family. And so we dug in. We did a full eval on my dad. We ultimately decided that based upon his physical health conditions and the fact that he had onset dementia, that we were going to focus on quality of life over quantity of life. And we ultimately took my dad from 17 medications down to, I believe, 3. And we worked with his primary care physician and a geriatric specialist to titrate him down and remove the medications. And the net impact for my dad through that experience was, one, he didn't get any better, but he didn't get any worse, at least right out of the gate. For my mom, it was significantly easier to manage my dad and his conditions because she wasn't trying to pump him full of 17 meds a day. And then there was certainly the financial aspect. And so that was really the beginning of evolvedMD, is saying, hey, there's a ton of utility in this experience that I just had with my own dad. How can we give that to other people? And then obviously there's a lot of things that happened between that experience and today, but I wanted to pause there, Park, just to see if you had any questions.
Wow. I mean, like you said, it's that personal journey that so often propels entrepreneurial spirit. So tell us, what is evolvedMD, and how did you, and what is the main problem you are helping people overcome?
Yeah. So this is the back end of that story. And so based upon the personal experience I had with my dad, who also happened to have a depression as one of his comorbidities, is that we went in and we launched our medication therapy management program at an internal med practice here in Phoenix. We ran that program for 6 months with a pharmacist embedded in that practice. And during that experience, we learned a couple of things. One, there's a ton of clinical utility in that particular model, leveraging pharmacists at the top of their licensure. But number two, it's a really expensive program to scale and to deliver to the market. And so we had this experience that a lot of entrepreneurs have, which is, failure in some cases, and then a reinvention from that failure. And so from the experience of running a pharmacist program where we embedded them into the clinic, we learned a lot about clinical delivery, but we learned even more about mental health. Because as we managed during the pilot phase, we managed 400 patients. We used a PHQ-9 screen to screen all of our patients for depression. And gosh, guess what we found out? 80% of the patients on our panel screened positive for depression, and none of these chronically ill patients had ever had a behavioral health resource. And so that was the pivot point. That was where we figured out there was an opportunity to change our direction and focus on a very important need, which is mental health. And we did that back in 2016, went right back to the market with an integrated behavioral health program, and at that point in time became the first commercial provider of an integrated behavioral health model known as psychiatric collaborative care. And that was really the beginning of evolvedMD as we see it today. And so to kind of get back to your question, what is evolvedMD? Today, we are a behavioral health resource organization solely focused on the integration of behavioral health services in the primary care setting. We place clinicians on site embedded at the practice so that they can, one, engage patients to help support their mental health needs, and two, collaborate with their physical health providers to really focus on whole patient care. Today, we've got over 100 sites under contract representing 500 PCPs throughout Arizona and Utah, and we're beginning a national expansion. So it's a very exciting time for us.
And I told Sentari a couple months ago that I experienced you all in sort of a surprising way, because I knew he was working over there, but I had not done my deep dive into exactly what evolvedMD was. But my wife and I moved up here to Northern Arizona a year and a half ago. And I needed to find a family practice and go in and get my annual checkup, which I did. And I walked in and I saw your little poster there prominently displayed in the lobby. And I go, oh, there they are. And then when I went in and they came in and went through the typical Q&A, are you feeling this and how you doing here? And they take your temperature and your weight and your pulse and all that stuff. Then they started going through this litany of mental health questions. And I thought, really, okay, this is the sign of the times with COVID and whatever, but I had never gone through that much of, I don't know, they asked me like 20 different questions. How are you feeling about this and about this? To, I guess, do a panel on me to determine, was there a problem? And if there is some mental health challenges or stress or anxiety or whatever it is, that you all were there so that, I could get help or a patient could get help. Well, apparently I tested all right because they didn't recommend that I moved on to evolvedMD. But when I got home, I gave a shout out to Sentari and I said, hey, man, I get what you guys do now. And oh, by the way, this family practitioner up in Flagstaff, I thought was doing a brilliant job of testing their folks, not just for their physical health, but their mental health. And then realizing, boy, you had an opportunity of getting help right away with you all being there. So I wanted to share that just for all of our listeners to get a better sense of maybe exactly how you apply that. What did I miss in that, Sentari? Is there something else in your delivery that I'm missing there?
No, I think that really sums up and showcases our model in action. Really, the idea would be you as a patient would go to your primary care provider and they would do the screening exactly how they did their park in Flagstaff. So shout out to them for really looking at the model and doing it with efficacy. So they would screen you, see if you had anything that would show some signs of heightened symptoms that would mean that you need to go see one of our behavioral health managers. And our model is really interested in that we embed those behavioral health managers right into the practice. And so if there was something that showed up, Park, that primary care physician would say, hey, Park, we have a behavioral health manager, Janie, right down the hall. She would love to talk to you. And if she's not there, we can schedule that for your next visit. And so it's a really cool model in that it's not only collaborative, but it's it increases access because of the easeability of it. And then also the fact that you probably trust your physician quite well. So if they're making a recommendation to see this person, you're likely going to take it. So it's a really cool trifecta of things that come together to make sure that you get the care that you need, not just physically, but mentally too.
So let me ask you, Sentari, the stigma about mental health, and so many people want to hide it. And yet, everybody suffers from a certain amount of stress and anxiety. And probably, I'm sure the pandemic has brought that out even more in people. And yet I think a lot of people like to tamp that down and, put on the brave face and buckle up and say, nope, I'm good. But we know that just there's a lot more conversation out and about on mental health. How have you seen the stigma around mental health change? Has it opened up more since the pandemic, or how are you all dealing with that?
Yeah, and I'll jump in, and then Eric, I know he has some interesting views on this too. What we've seen is that there's a lot of data that shows upwards of half of adults in America have one or two negative symptoms as it relates to mental health, especially during the COVID era. So I think if there's one good thing that came out of COVID and the isolation and all the things and adverse reactions is the fact that everyone was struggling, and then people realized that their neighbors, their friends, their family members, their bosses were also struggling. So it became this collective nationwide conversation. So we've actually seen more and more potential customers, more and more potential supporters say, hey, I'm hearing this from all of my stakeholders, whether that's my employees, my family, my coworkers, and this is something that people are talking about more. And so I'm actually excited about the fact that COVID has brought this to the forefront, and you hear more and more vulnerable stories of, I suffered through this, my family lost this, I wasn't able to deal with all the stress at work and I was hiding it, but now I know that bringing it up and being vulnerable can only make that better for everyone else. So I think that while COVID was definitely a large net negative for the country, and we can go on about that, I think the big positive thing was mental health came out as a forefront of something that we need to not only discuss, but continuously invest in and figure out ways to bring to more people.
Yeah, and that's great context, Sentari. And number one, Park, going back to your story from Flagstaff, that's an awesome. We love hearing those stories. And I, as you were saying that, my mind was saying, welcome to modern healthcare, Park. This is the future, And I think that thinking about the body and mind as two separate things is now gone by the wayside. And Sentari talked about COVID and how it's really pushed this to the forefront. When we talk about stigma, a lot of times we actually focus a lot on the patient and the patient experience and getting them over this hurdle of seeking care, at least for the first time, because that's the big win, right? They go to therapy once and they actually realize that it's not what they've thought it was all along. It's about skill building and reframing and all the things that are important as we build skills and deploy them. But the other aspect of stigma that really is important to talk about is stigma within the healthcare community. For a long, long time, behavioral health and physical health have been managed within two separate silos, both on the delivery side, so how patient care is delivered, and even on the payer side, right? Even today, most of the national insurance providers have a behavioral health insurance arm and a physical health insurance arm. And a lot of those barriers are being broke down from a systematic perspective, but we still have work to do within the primary care and the physical health space. And this notion that a primary care provider can simply focus on the fact that I've got a patient in front of me that has diabetes, but isn't controlling their blood glucose. And why is that? And I see them every month and their blood glucose is still uncontrolled. And why is that? Well, it's because in many cases, these patients have underlying behavioral health disorders, right? That diabetic patient probably lacks motivation. That lack of motivation is driven by maybe an underlying depressive disorder. And so it's really hard to address this physical health condition unless you step in and you address the underlying BH issue. And so what's really interesting about this feature of medicine, which involves integrated behavioral health, is that for the first time, we're really tackling the whole patient. And we're not just looking at the physical health symptom of diabetes, we're looking at the whole patient and we're trying to support all of their needs. And so, to me, stigma's on both ends. It's the provider side, we've got to knock down the stigma for them so that they adopt these new practices. And for the patients, we've got to eliminate all of the barriers around stigma and access to widen and expand care.
So how do you do that? I mean, what have you found to be effective through your communication and your storytelling to take that stigma head on and to help overcome it?
Park, I don't know if you saw this, but I recently authored an article for Medium about exactly that. Like, how do you leverage storytelling, marketing, communications for mental health impact? And I think what evolvedMD does a really good job is, one, being very vulnerable from top to bottom about just sharing our mental health stories. So one of the probably most powerful things I've seen in a company, and I'm so glad I got to be a part of it, was about this time last year, we got all of our company together and just had, a day and offsite for everything. And I put like an hour on the calendar for us to kind of just share our whys and our stories about what brought us here. And it ended up being a 3 or 4 hour session where everyone was deeply vulnerable about what brought them to evolvedMD and why they're attracted to this work, from things from eating disorders to parent suicide to their own suicidal ideation. We got really deep and really heavy. And that was the first time I've ever seen in a company where people have galvanized and really connected around something as personal and deep as that. And so we truly believe in being vulnerable, and that shows in every piece of our marketing and branding and communications. And so in that article, I talk about internally, we're always sharing mission moments and stories from the field. So patient wins, patient struggles, what we're hearing about our impact on our patients, but also things that are happening within the company about our employees, what's going on there, where they have some very big successes. And one of the other things I'm very proud of is that in our company, we are also very big on creating this idea of psychological safety, whereas my direct reports know, and we've created this atmosphere where they can give really good feedback. They can be really vulnerable. They can tell me what's going on, and then we can work on those things collaboratively to make sure that they feel okay. And all those things come together in a really cool way that you can definitely see on our LinkedIn, on Facebook, and the things that we post. And we're really pushing people, our customers, our employees, folks in the ecosystem, to say, like, for this to work, you have to share your own stories and you have to be okay with that. And you have to let people see that it's very much okay that people are struggling. It's very much okay that people are getting help, and it's going to only make you, your business, your company, whatever, that might be better. So our marketing and branding efforts are solely, or rather, we prioritize the storytelling of every one of our stakeholders in that.
I noticed that on LinkedIn, that was about a month or so ago, one of your employees, there was a gentleman in there, was talking about his struggle with mental health. And I believe it was anxiety and stress. And he went into it quite deeply.
Yes.
And I read it at first, thought, wow. I mean, it's a balance between finding the courage to do that. But then I also imagine, Eric and Sentari, that you also have to be careful that it doesn't look like you are trying to capitalize on someone's troubles that brought them there. It's sort of that fine balance, isn't it?
That's a good question. The gentleman you're talking about is actually my direct report, Evan. And he and I, again, going back to the psychological safety, have great conversations from supervisor to direct report about, like, what's going on in your life? What do you need? And part of his KPIs, so thinking about, like, how do you incentivize and internalize this, is it's like, hey, Evan, what seems like it's going to be a good outlet for you, it's writing about it. And so he has, and it's something that has been really effective for him in his own mental health journey. But he also wants to make sure that people understand what anxiety looks like from a working professional. So it's something that's cathartic for him, good for overall branding. And at the end of the day, it's just a really good reminder that sometimes just getting it out there is the best thing that you can do.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think what's unique about the behavioral health space is you've got a lot of folks that understand that stigma is a big issue, and And one of the best ways to break down that barrier is to talk about their own experience, right? Because by sharing your own, personal story, people understand, and to some degree it normalizes it, right? I mean, we do this both in professional settings and personal settings. I had, over the last couple of weeks, I've had two conversations with dear friends of mine sharing my story, how I first went to counseling, what it felt like to me, the value that I got out of it, and encouraging them to go down that journey themselves. And so I think, this is what's different about a mental health company than traditional companies, where, we understand part of the need for the community to support and expand services is to knock down these barriers and reduce stigma. And many of us are very willing to share our own stories. The other thing I wanted to address, Park, is, we talked about how we present ourselves to the larger market, but, how do we actually break down and reduce stigma at the clinical level? So to me, it's really twofold. You've got the clinicians, right? Clinicians have an existing stigma around mental health. And this is related to a number of issues, whether it's past payment coverage, whether it's time, whether it's their patients actually have these issues. And so you have to tackle that. And you have to, in some cases, challenge them to think about whole health in a different way.
I just want to dive a little bit deeper into that. So what you're telling me is you've got practitioners out there that they are really focused on the physical health of the body, and they may be somewhat dismissive of the mental health, and I might not be able to get paid as much on that. Is that what I'm hearing you say? And there's I don't really have symptoms that I can, qualify and write down here. And so I'm out of my swim lane, and I'm just going to kind of push the mental health off to the side. Is that the stigma you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we've created a healthcare system that is volume based, and I'm not sharing any particular secret. And we've placed a lot of physicians in a situation where they have to manage a lot of patients in a very short period of time. And as a result for that, they have to pick and choose what they're able to focus on. And if they're going to focus on something, they want to be able to take action. And so for a long time, even the primary care providers that have wanted to take action on the mental health component, they haven't felt comfortable with the resources available to them. And so the default is to do nothing. And so, to me, that's the big change, right? The default is no longer nothing. There are viable options out there to integrate. And so, the system we've created is very complex. There's a lot of drivers and incentives that are baked in that don't ultimately lead to good patient care. Unfortunately, some of these incentives and some of the structural elements of healthcare have led to bad mental health, right? Poor mental health services or no mental health services. So we've got this huge subset of the population that needs services and has never received them.
As I hear that, then thinking I am a physician, a family practice, practitioner, and of course, my whole goal is to keep that patient as healthy as possible. Of what I know about, that's the physical nature of that. But they don't have, or in the past did not have access to what evolvedMD offers. Therefore, now it's no longer an option that they just pass on it because they don't have the time or energy to research it and go and find that support. You all show up in the family practice and provide it there immediately for anyone that happens to be coming through that physician identifies that they may be dealing with a mental health challenge and maybe not dealing with it. They are suffering from a mental health challenge, not dealing with it, and now you make that support easier to access than ever.
Correct. Yeah, I think the excuses, the time for excuses on expanding into this area, if you're a primary care physician, are gone. This is about their patient well-being and convenience, and again, eliminating the barriers for the patients to get them care. The best analogy I would give to you on this, Park, and this is more of a physical health component, but like for me as a consumer, I will not go to a primary care site that does not draw my blood on site. I'm not going to do it. It's not convenient. It's not practical. And so that is one of the criterias that I've used to establish who I want to see. I believe that in a future state, patients and consumers are going to prioritize whole health care, which includes mental health. And so providers that choose not to go down this path, one, they're going to be providing subpar care to their patients. And two, they're not going to be competitive in the consumer marketplace. People are going to choose other providers based upon these things.
Well, when you think about the whole, the holistic care of people and the health of them, how much our brain comes into play here. And all you got to look, to a physician or the pharmaceutical world and say placebo. So here, I'm going to give you a sugar pill, and your brain is going to extrapolate from that. It's going to help me. And so the brain is so remarkably powerful in our health, and God knows what stress and anxiety does to us and how it tears us down and increases our heart rate and pumps us full of cortisol that is not good for us. So it just seems to me that like mental health and physical health go hand in glove. And what you guys are doing out there seems like it's just a long time in coming. So when you talk about stigma, in my world, I would put that in the anti-story realm. When someone is telling themselves an anti-story about something that you are providing, or you've got this stigma, or maybe they, put a whole community within this group and there's a stigma about that. It's simply an anti-story they're telling themselves. So Sentari, internally with your mission moments, how, and maybe you can give us an example of one of them too, how are you using powerful real world stories to combat that anti-story? Because we know the only way to overcome an anti-story or stigma is with a better story, true story, well told.
Yeah, so we're fortunate to have a culture of storytelling within the organization. So the folks who are our frontline providers do a good job of capturing those stories in clinic. And I think a short one that came up recently that I really like is one of our behavioral health managers was seeing a patient who was referred to them by their primary care physician. So exactly how it would be at Flagstaff Park. And this person at first, because of the stigma, went in saying, like, I don't need this. I'm not a crazy person. That's that's what they reported saying. And then sitting down with our mental health professional and really understanding what it was about after a couple of sessions, he came back and reflected and said, I can actually sleep at night now. I can actually breathe. And these are things that he wasn't thinking about because it wasn't framed in the right way of mental health. And he had a stigma about like only crazy people, only those people that we see on the street or in the movies. Those are the people that should be sitting in his seat. And after going through and actually having the conversation and just seeing what it was all about, he realized he had some mental health challenges and some issues. And those things were ultimately being worked on in this process. And he was very thankful for that. And we just see countless stories of folks not being actually adversarial about being referred to the program, and then after a couple of sessions saying, like, I don't know how I would have done. How would I've gotten through this without you? And we've actually heard that from a lot of our customers too. After being there for 6 months to a year, a lot of folks are using the stories to say, hey, we don't know what we did before you guys were here. We don't know how we functioned. And it's really cool to hear just on a daily basis from the folks on the front lines, how they're actually showing impact each and every day, how they're hearing from patients, how we've impacted their lives. And then I think stories like the one that I just shared show how there's still very much a negative or anti-story around mental health and getting help for mental health. And that's something that we use powerfully every day. And I think from a macro level, our leadership team really does model that. I've been on a couple of podcasts recently, or at least in the last year, and I've told my story about how why evolvedMD was so attractive to me is because it really does a good job of pulling out those stories from executive leadership. And for me, it's been really important for me to talk to especially young men about, I've been in therapy since I was 25, and I went into it with a lot of a stigma and just not understanding like why this is something I would do, but I know I needed to value it. And it's me telling that story. I've had so many guys come up and say like, man, this was a really good way for me to think about how I'm going to approach therapy. Like, oh, you do this. I trust you. I respect you. It must be something that's good. And just, we don't realize how much folks that look up to us or even peers that see us as someone that they want to emulate, that can drive therapy too. So always everyone on our leadership team is really, really comfortable with telling their personal stories, and that cascades to the organization too.
Well, thank you for that, Sentari. Eric, can I ask you about your story with therapy? Because you said that had a big impact in the building of evolvedMD and the brand.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, my first experience with therapy is I actually went to family counseling with my wife. We had a very challenging period of time with our daughter who had a cancer diagnosis at an early age, and that was my first entree into counseling. And I think at that moment in time, we had developed a plan to kind of accommodate for the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. And we felt like we were doing things right, but there was this ambiguity as to, what could happen next. And my wife and I decided to invest in that aspect of our mental health. And we went to see a counselor. And for my wife, she had been in the past, but this was my first experience. And I really enjoyed it, more so because it validated that we, had a sound plan. We were making good decisions. And we got to talk about some of the things that were in the back of our minds during that process. And fortunately for your listeners, we had a great outcome. My daughter has been cancer free now for 5 years, but that was my first foray. I didn't go back to counseling until about 7 months ago, and honestly, Sentari was a big part of pushing me back into that realm. And I didn't feel like I had a lot to unpack, and I think that's what I was struggling with is the things that were giving me anxiety or keeping me up at night. I felt like they were very easily explained. We were growing a business, we were raising capital, we were doing all the things in this challenging environment that created these types of feelings. But Sentari really challenged me to go, and I agreed to do it. And the last 7 months have been a really enjoyable experience, getting to understand why I feel a certain way about certain things and why I do things. And to me, and this is the way I explain it to my friends, is therapy is not about sitting on a couch with a box of Kleenex telling your deepest, darkest secrets. Therapy for a lot of people is about framing the way you view your life, both the positives and the negatives, and then working on skills and then deploying those skills in your everyday life. And so for me, I get anxious from time to time. The great thing with things with managing your anxiety is there are some very basic skills around breathing or meditation or others that you can deploy. And so for me, when I talk to my friends about my therapy journey, it's largely about reframing the way that I've looked at certain aspects of my life, whether it was my parents, my upbringing, my relationships. And it's about skill building, right? Taking very tangible things that I can deploy when I feel a certain way. And guess what? If you're disciplined about these things and you start to build up those skills, when you need them, they work. I talk a lot about these things now with my close friends because we're all going through a point in time in our lives where we're, in our early 40s, our kids are getting older, our professional careers are getting more advanced. And so I've just seen it as this wonderful resource to help, make my life better and make me a better husband, a better father, and a better person to work alongside.
Eric, thank you for sharing that, and so happy to hear about your daughter and getting through that. That just had to have been terrifying. We've got 3 kids and now a grandchild, and I can't even imagine going through that and the impact. And as you were talking about that, I keep thinking about this idea of stigma. And, we go and we work out to get in good shape, and we hire trainers, we hire nutritionists to keep us healthy. We do if you're going to go play golf, you hire a golf coach that teaches you how to play both physically and mentally the game. But when it comes down to mental health or just career guidance or, whatever it might be, why is it that we look at that as a weakness? When we're willing to strengthen muscles that we view as weak, why do we look at our mental health as a weakness?
Apark, that's a great question. And I think the good news there is the generation that's coming after us, they view this completely differently. I mean, I now have a 11-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter, and we talk about, resiliency and mental health skills all the time. They talk about it at school. We're hiring a lot of young folks out of college that think about this differently. And so the world is changing. And I think that we are viewing these skills as more important, especially the younger generations. But I do think that where it's more challenging to overcome is folks that are, my age and older, right? We've bought into this story of weakness. And I think it's reframing what counseling is and the value that it can drive. And I think this is why we're so open to telling our own stories. This is why we're deploying a model in primary care where it's accessible. It's in a place it's in a care setting that people are familiar with and they're comfortable with it. So there's all of these small little details that go into our modeling and how we deliver to patients, specifically of my age or older, that are designed to kind of overcome this view that we've had for a lifetime.
I was struggling with some stuff. The move up here was discombobulating, to say the least, and it was right during the pandemic and everything the pandemic brought. And of course, my business suffered like so many did, and then building it back up again. And you go through a lot of worries and a lot of self-doubt, and of course, mental health creeps into it. And if you try to tackle it yourself, you can really get yourself into a deep hole very quickly. You've got to have that person from the outside looking in. And I was on LinkedIn about a year and a half ago, and it was probably my most troubling time, going on between my ears. And someone there recommended this old book by Dale Carnegie, called How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. And this was written right after World War II. I think it came in 1951. And yet everything that you read in that book, and what Dale Carnegie did is we ran around interviewing all of the captains of industries, which would have been his pals, and talked to them about how they overcame worry. And almost to a man, because he talks much more about men back there, but a few women sprinkled in given the time, is they almost every single one of them came to near physical collapse due to worry and the fact that they weren't dealing with the challenges, and they didn't know how to deal with the challenges until they got connected with a psychologist, or in some cases a psychiatrist, or a very advanced primary health physician that says, Bob, you need to take care of this. And the blood pressure would go down. And, Bob, you got to take care of this. You're going to have a heart attack. So this has been known for decades and decades. And I love this book. I mean, you can buy it for all of $9.99. And it is ageless wisdom in helping you how to stop worry and start living, and some very practical guidance in it. I just think it's brilliant. So that leads to my next long-winded way of asking Sentari, how do you coach and how do you build into the business model that primary care physician, like, the gentleman I saw up in Flagstaff, and maybe I go through and I check off this thing and he goes, well, you may have a challenge here. I would like to, recommend you over to evolvedMD, but then I push back. No, that's for the crazies, like Eric said. Do you equip those physicians with stories or ways to overcome that right there in the exam room to get people to take that next step, to at least have that first conversation with your practitioner there?
I'll have Eric come in on the back end of this, but I think the beauty of our model is that it's actually called collaborative care, right? So our team works in collaboration with the physical health team. So there's just so much trust built in already. And then for the most part, people really trust their primary care physicians. And so that pushback is really them leaning into their own relationship, the PCP and the patient, but also, yes, having the stories, being equipped with those stories, and also having the BHM, behavioral health manager, just on site, just having that kind of trust and collaboration there makes the patient feel welcome. There's a warm handoff. And I do think, to your point, Park, having the stories and arming our providers with the impactful stories of, hey, I know what you're thinking, but trust me, you're going to feel so much better after this. Or I've had a patient just like you, someone who's, very successful, doesn't really feel like they need this, but they seem to like it. How about you give it a try? And there's the through line through that is the impact of a story on getting a patient to overcome that stigma. But I would say more so is more relying on how we've equipped on the back end the stories to create that sense of trust between the provider and the PCP. And Eric, I would love to hear your thoughts on some of the kind of tangible things around that too.
I love to hear you tell the story, Sentari, because you're spot on in a number of aspects there. The other piece of this is it's about planting a seed with that patient too, right? We're not going to pull every patient every time across the line, but this is why the relationship with the primary care provider is so important. It's continuous, it's established. They're going to see that patient again. And so if I saw a patient today and I had that conversation with them, Park, I might plant the seed, and then I might come back to that in a month when they're back in the clinic. And so, we don't have to change Rome in a day. And I think we don't have to have this idea that we bring all of the patients over at one time. But when we do have those conversations, we train primary care providers, right? Validate the way that these patients are feeling and then normalize it, right? And get them to understand that the way that they're feeling, it's not unique. We have other patients that feel that way. And this is why we have the resource here on site. In some cases, we can walk that patient down the hall and do a brief introduction, right? Kind of set the tone for what's to come. But, it's a process, and some patients take longer to pull over. And this is why we're there. And we've got a continuous relationship with these practices, with the providers, and with their patients. And over time, we'll get more wins than we get losses. But, it certainly is something that is just an ongoing dialogue with these patients.
Terrific. Final question for the both of you. I'd love to get both of your answers on this. To help a company, help an organization, help a leader and the people they're in service to overcome stigma or an anti-story that is being told, how, and maybe if you've got one or two or three tips, would love to hear them. How do you operationalize storytelling in a company to overcome those anti-stories or stigma?
I'll start, and then Eric, I'll let you close us out. I think one, just again, modeling. And so if you're a leader of a company, there's just so much research around how being a vulnerable leader makes you a better leader. So I would challenge anyone listening to this to really get comfortable with themselves and get really comfortable sharing the stories of success and strife. I think we are really good at doing that as an executive team, and our people see that. And I think one of the coolest things that's happened in the last 2 weeks, actually, I do a quarterly psychological safety kind of exercise with my direct reports. And all of their feedback was, I've never been in a company where a leader would ask me these questions and a leader will let me be vulnerable because I can see them being vulnerable. And some of the questions, Park, it's a lot of them giving feedback to me. And some of that feedback was hard to take, but they got to see that, oh, I was actually listening and I was being vulnerable in that moment. And that just creates an environment where more and more people are open to sharing, and that sharing leads to really good stories of impact. I would say too, make it an intention within your company to capture stories. And so for our frontline behavioral health managers, it's always top of mind for them to get patient stories and then stories about how they've interacted with the staff. And so, and we make it really easy on the marketing side to kind of send those and share those. And so I would say make an intention throughout the company that you're gonna, as you see stories happening, you share those stories and you write them down. And I think 3, and the final one, and perhaps the most important one, is letting people know the power of story. It's probably because of you, Park, that through my career has been telling and coaching a lot of leaders that that you can have the best product, but if you don't have a compelling story as to why you want that product to go to market or why you've started this, it doesn't matter. And so really telling people throughout the company that while you might think it's just a small thing to capture a great moment you had with your patient and get the details behind that, it actually makes this so much bigger and so much more powerful. And so I just always lean on for business leaders to understand that storytelling is not a nice to have, it's a must have, and that's not something of fluff. It can actually drive some business value, and a lot of business value too, if you do it the right way.
That's beautiful, Sentari. Man,
thank you for that.
I was second everything that Sentari says. He's been a big part of why and how we've been so intentional in this particular space. I think he's spot on. As a leader of an organization, you have to be committed to being vulnerable and sharing certain aspects of your life and your story with employees, because again, it normalizes it, and it's generally a good strategy. Beyond that, I would say it's probably a good thing to actually be fully committed to both the personal and professional success of everybody on your team. And so we talk about intention and how we go about engaging the employees on our team. And I'll give you an example. I have a one-on-one every week with my directors, and every single one of those engagements has somewhat of a standardized agenda. And that not only applies to my directors, but to everybody that reports up to them. And the first thing that we do on every single one-on-one is we do a personal and professional check-in. Because at the end of the day, how folks are performing professionally is directly related to how they're doing personally. And if there are things within our employees' lives that they want to share and that we can support with, we're willing to do that. And I don't just ask them, I share what's going on in my life as well. And so again, I think it's really about leading from the front and being willing to be vulnerable. And, for us, we've been very intentional of it. And it's directly tied to the things that Sentari and a number of other leaders on our team are putting into place every day.
Yeah, you guys are doing amazing work out there. I've had an opportunity of somewhat, working in your industry with Embark Behavioral Health here, in the Valley, and they've got facilities throughout the country. And they just sponsored a Ken Burns produced documentary on PBS that, as of this recording, the second episode is airing tonight, called Hiding in Plain Sight: Youth Mental Illness. And we'll have links to this in the show notes for anyone interested in it. And Sentari, it's just like what you said earlier. If you're going to overcome the stigma, you got to be talking about it, and you got to be sharing these kinds of stories. And it's in such the forefront now. Even a gentleman filmmaker like Ken Burns is tackling it. And as you were saying that, and I don't want to get, too maudlin about this, but I was almost thinking, Eric, as you were talking about earlier, in the physical health world that our medical care is built around, when you're thinking about business storytelling, that's kind of the physical bulleted list, features and functions. Let me communicate that stuff of how we're built here and what we make happen. But the psychological side of it, the mental health side of a company, is the storytelling side of it. you've got to be vulnerable. You've got to be open, and you've got to let your guard down and just be, truthful and honest with your people through the stories you tell. I thought that was kind of an interesting parallel that just hit me while you were both talking there. Bottom line is you are doing an amazing job, amazing work out at evolvedMD, and I just really can't thank you enough for coming on the show and sharing with our listeners, number one, the service that's available to them, and number two, how you are using storytelling to overcome this stigma. And I suppose I should ask, where can people find you in the clinics out there? Are you nationwide? Are you just the Southwest? Where do they find you, and what are your plans for growth?
Great question. Obviously, we would refer you to our website, www.evolvedMD.com. We've also got a significant presence on LinkedIn and a number of other social media sites that Sentari and the team are doing an excellent job on. Currently today, evolvedMD is operating in Arizona, Tucson, Phoenix Metro, Flagstaff, and Sedona, as well as a satellite in Prescott. We're also operating in the greater Salt Lake City area, so pretty much Ogden down to Provo. We do have the intention to expand nationally. We're looking at a number of states currently, and later this year we will expand into our third state, and then 2023 is a much larger expansion nationally. So more to come, spreading our wings, doing the good work, and it's been a lot of fun, and it's very impactful along the way. So Park, thank you for letting us share our story, and really, I really enjoyed hearing Sentari because we work alongside each day, and sometimes these stories actually get lost amongst ourselves. So it was beautiful to hear Sentari kind of share his piece of this. And again, thank you for letting us be part of the show.
Yeah, this is fun.
My pleasure. And thank you all for listening to this really important edition of the Business of Story. If you liked what you heard, if you're struggling, then by all means, reach out and get some help. Or if you know of someone, friend, family member, colleague, loved one who is struggling with it, let's remove the stigma and let's just get them support out there, because there are so much amazing work happening around the world on this. And I'm just honored that evolvedMD is doing what they're doing right here in Arizona, and we can be kind of an epicenter for this whole new, more holistic approach to both physical and mental health care. So just, please share this episode, and by all means, head over to their website, evolvedMD, that's evolvedMD.com, to learn more. It'll all be in the show notes. And if I can be of service to you, come on over to the Business of Story, and I will help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. And we will have yet another amazing story artist right here for you on Monday, just like Eric and Sentari. And until then, more important than ever, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.